David Bradshaw and the essence energies distinction. If you haven't heard of it, it's actually a really important feature of metaphysics. That's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. David, welcome.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Nathan. It's great to see you, and I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah. So you are a former colleague. You are a friend. But you actually, I should probably tell a little bit in case folks are unfamiliar with you. So you are a philosopher. You teach philosophy at the University of Kentucky. You are a well-published, very well-respected, and excellent, I'll speak as a scholar, excellent scholar. And perhaps your most famous book, I actually happen to have it here. This isn't a plant. I just happened to glance over and notice that I really do have it. Your book, Aristotle, East and West, which is an excellent work related to the topic we'll be talking about today. But, you have any number of other books and articles to your credit and all that. But I think what most folks know you for is actually this essence energies distinction. Is that fair to say, like, that's what you're sort of notorious for?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that book came out in 2004. So it's been 20 years now, and I have written an awful lot since then. But the book is still, I think, kind of what people think of when they see my name.
Yeah, I understand that. I have certain books that people think of me of, even if I don't want them to think of me for that book. But anyway, that book was actually highly influential on me. I don't know if you realize this, but for myself, I went on this long journey. It was in philosophy and theology, but, it was all existentially driven, right? I was looking for answers to big questions about, is there a God? Do we have free will? What happens when we die and all that? And at some point, that journey led me to the Eastern Church Fathers, and they turned my world upside down because at the time I had become, in my investigation of Christianity, which really started with Augustine and then moving backwards to influences on Augustine, like Plotinus, which then I had to look at Plato and I had to look at, all this ancient philosophy. And then I started looking forward at the effects in the medieval scholastics and then on into the post-Reformation scholastics. I went into that hopeful, let's see if there's answers here, but I slowly became more and more disillusioned for reasons that we'll probably talk about today. And I became an opponent of Western Christianity. And in general, historical Christianity, or so I thought, because that's the only form. The Western Latin tradition was the only one that I really knew. But I remember once I started digging into the Eastern Fathers, which happened because I was in a patrology class and I was with a patrologist. And so the entire point of the class was we're going to look at the Eastern Fathers from Nicaea to Constantinople. And reading them turned my world upside down because what I knew when I first read Athanasius, what I knew is I know enough about what I'm reading to know that I don't fully understand what I'm reading and that this is different from the other things, but I wasn't sure why. And I wasn't sure what the difference was. And it disoriented me heavily, became obsessive about the Eastern Fathers and trying to understand them. And along the way, one of the things that I came across was this essence energies distinction. I could see it in the Cappadocians, where they're talking about the energies of God. And I was like, I don't even know what that is, right? I think most folks today, like contemporary America, if they hear energy in the context of religion, they think of like New Age, like spiritual energy, right? And I was like, I've never seen this in any sort of, ancient text. I have no orientation to what this is talking about. And so I started following that distinction. I ended up reading Gregory Palamas. At some point, I started looking for sources. I read Vladimir Lossky on this topic, but it always seemed so opaque, so opaque to me because I think as a metaphysician, right? And a lot of those treatises, they were talking about things, seeing God, right? This being God, but, it not being God's essence and all this sort of stuff. And I was like, okay, but I'm made of questions. Can we break this down in some analytic form? And I could never find that as much as I was digging, and I remember coming across, I think it was an article of yours at first in Faith and Philosophy. And then that one awakened me to your book, Aristotle, East and West. And I'm so grateful for that book, David. I've never told you that, so I'll tell you that publicly here. Thank you for writing that book. Because finally, when I read it, I was like, this is what I needed, right? Because you're going through like, well, there's sort of a prelude to this distinction in Plato, and here's the terminology being used, and then here's how it is in Aristotle, and all these things that I'm sure a lot of people would be like, yawn, like, why are we getting this? But that's exactly what I needed, right? I was sitting here going, walk me through what this distinction is, how it evolves over time, why it matters, why it's metaphysically coherent, all that sort of stuff. And basically your book, after that, everything made sense, right? I could see the distinction, not only in how it evolves over time, all of a sudden the Eastern Fathers I was reading made sense. I could see it in St. Paul. St. Paul made sense in, again, things I had come across in Paul that I didn't think made sense before, now started to make sense. So it began to open up a whole world to me. It made clear to me what was happening in the Cappadocians. It made clear to me Eastern Orthodoxy. It made clear to me the Eastern Orthodox view of salvation and how it was different than the Latin West, and all of these sorts of things. And that's really largely thanks to your book. Your book was the one that sort of clarified all of that for me. So thank you. I owe you a lot.
Well, thank you, Nathan. I really appreciate your kind words. The book began as a dissertation, right? So that's a lot of the ho-hum aspect, I think, maybe,
right.
Particularly for most people in the first half,
right?
Where I'm talking a lot about Aristotle and some pretty obscure people, the Middle Platonists, and the Plotinus, of course, less obscure, but then other Neoplatonists. And there's some fairly technical material, but I'm with you 100% in that. For me as a philosopher, that's really where you have to start. You have to understand ancient philosophy, because that's the culture that the Greek fathers were working in, that they were deeply embedded within. All their terminology and their fundamental ways of thinking are really rooted in ancient Greek culture, and especially, I think, ancient Greek philosophy. And if you understand that beginning, then you turn to the fathers and you see, well, yeah, of course, this is what they're going to say, right? Because if you're a Christian and you're trying to articulate the gospel and the message of Scripture in language that this Greek culture will understand, this is exactly how you'll do it.
Yeah.
And it does, everything falls into place if you just take it chronologically, as I do in that book, and allow these authors to speak for themselves.
Yeah.
There's really no one has a kind of a hidden agenda. No one is, trying to found their own cult or anything. They're all in the same great project of restating Christian truth in Greek terms that the Greek culture then could embrace, as they did. And of course, that's really what leads to Eastern Orthodoxy.
Yeah. Now, one of the things I want to put out there right away, because of part of my own background, is that, this isn't just a Greek fathers project. And what I mean by that is there's this sort of Adolf von Harnack style, way of thinking that's like, well, look, there was Judaism, which had no philosophy. And then there was the New Testament, which had no philosophy. And then at some point, a bunch of pagan converts come along and they start to insert philosophy, and they molest this Jewish religion and turn it into something else. And, of course, for people like Harnack, and that's just an extension, actually, of the entire German philosophy sort of progress notion that's suggesting that Harnack's not necessarily saying that as a bad thing, right? For people like Hegel and others, they see this, or G.E. Lessing, even, you see this this is just part of the slow unveiling of God and the revelation of God, and we just slowly catch up. And of course, for people like Hegel, it's And of course, I'm the culmination of all these things, right?
Yes.
So yes, I'm different than the New Testament and than the fathers, but this is all part of the progress that has been working toward me, right?
Mm, yeah.
um, but so not necessarily a polemic for them, but in certain circles, certain Christian circles, like evangelical circles, for example, that is a polemic, right? Um, where folks have to explain, well, like what went wrong with Christianity so that we needed a reformation. And you have to suggest that there's some sort of corrupting influence where Christianity was lost, and oftentimes Greek philosophy becomes the explanation. It just got sort of infected and molested and became this other thing, and we've got to recover the original Christianity. It also becomes a narrative that's useful for people like open theists, right? So open theists, for people who don't know, take the view that's highly innovative historically to say that God doesn't know the future. And so that's contrary to Christian tradition, where God has foreknowledge of the future. So they have to explain, well, if that's true, if that's biblical, how is it possible that all Christians everywhere always thought that God did know the future? And the answer is, the influence of Greek philosophy. So this sort of narrative becomes a common way of trying to, in some ways, rip apart the Greek fathers and what they have to say from the Bible. But as your work has shown, and I'm absolutely convinced of, is that narrative is false. You already have Alexandrian. We don't have a lot of Alexandrian Judaism. Thankfully, we have Philo. But what we have testifies that Alexandrian Judaism was highly philosophical. It was highly involved. It was deeply involved in the conversation that you're describing about ideas that was happening amongst the pagans. And people, and that same sort of philosophical Judaism echoes in people like Paul. And Paul is deeply invested in this. And I'm convinced that there are certain things that Paul says that are utterly incoherent unless you recognize that Paul already has the essence energies distinction. So, and we can talk about that. But yeah, the reason I think that's important is because the Eastern Fathers are insistent that they're being true to something that they've received. You see this in the councils, right? They see this as tradition, right? Paradosis. It's what's being handed down to them. And they include in that the philosophy that they're doing, right? The essence energies distinction, they don't think is some sort of alien, imposed idea. And I'm convinced that it's true, right? I think the texts actually, bear that out, that it's not a sort of later invention that's fabricated and imposed on it.
Yeah. Well, it's a tragedy that the Reformation occurred at a time when Western scholarship really didn't have very solid grasp on the Greek fathers.
Yeah.
And Luther famously said, "Reason is a whore," and I think that encapsulates his attitude toward philosophy, because the philosophy he knew was late scholasticism.
Mm-hmm.
And it was decadent. Yeah, it had gone off the rails pretty badly. And I can understand the desire or the need to react against that. But it's just a shame that in some ways set the pattern for Protestant thought.
Mm-hmm.
Not that there haven't been, some philosophical influences within Protestant theology. Obviously, there, but the more it seems that with Protestantism, the more philosophical it becomes, the less orthodox it becomes,
Mm-hmm.
and you get these figures then, Kant, Hegel, maybe the most important, who, as they think through belief in God, they philosophically, that it just takes them straight out of Christianity altogether.
Right.
And in the ancient world, that was not the case at all.
Mm-hmm.
Philosophy was already a disciplined and very profound way of thinking about God. I mean, I call it a way, but of course, there were different schools of philosophy. You had the Platonists, the Peripatetics, the Stoics.
Mm-hmm.
Justin Martyr, in the beginning of his work, The Dialogue with Trypho,
Mm-hmm.
has this great little autobiography. I'm sure you know about this, Nathan,
Yeah.
but for those who don't, in which he describes how he was a student in a number of these different philosophical schools, looking for what they could teach him about God.
Yeah.
And some of it's kind of a spoof. He says, "Well, I went to the Pythagoreans and they said, oh, welcome, but you've got to master this geometry textbook first. And then I went to the peripatetics, and they said, well, we'll talk to you, but you have to pay your fee up front.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of an in joke because Aristotle famously says you have to have some degree of material goods to achieve
Right.
eudaimonia in
Right.
life. So, but ultimately, he ends up with the Platonists, and he does find in Plato a very rich, profound account of God, the good, and the trouble is that he's satisfied initially, but then he meets someone who is a Christian who challenges him with some of the less tenable aspects of Platonism, such as reincarnation,
Sure.
transmigration of souls, and
Mm-hmm.
so forth. And he realizes, that stuff is pretty absurd. And this Christian then opens to him the prophecies of the Messiah and how Jesus fulfills those prophecies and the teaching of Christ in the Gospels. And he sees that this is what he had really been seeking all along.
Right.
And it's not opposed to philosophy, it's the fulfillment of
Mm.
philosophy.
Right.
And Clement of Alexandria, writing just a little later in the early third century, he says that philosophy was given to the Greeks the way the law was given to the Jews,
Mm-hmm.
as a kind of a pedagogue, a teacher to lead them to Christ.
Right.
And that, I think, is really the attitude most of the church fathers had. It's not like pagan philosophy is the be all and end all. It went wrong in many ways, but there's still something there that is an authentic search for God,
Mm-hmm.
and we can build upon that and take that as establishing a lot of common ground with the pagan world,
Mm-hmm.
and then present the gospel within that context. And it really puts the gospel in a sharp light. You see things in the gospel you generally won't see if you don't have that background in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned St. Paul. I think reading St. Paul, knowing something about the terminology of energia, this word energy, really changed the way I think about him too. I saw he's that synergy, the idea of the cooperation and even coalescence of the energy between God and man is one of his central themes. He talks
Mm-hmm.
about it all over the place.
Right.
And you just don't see that when you read St. Paul, in an English translation with a typically Western background in mind. So there are a lot of things like that I think do become clear.
Yeah.
And to me, that's part of the value of orthodoxy, even for those who are not Orthodox. But I know many Protestants and even Catholics who love to study Orthodox theology because they find so much there that they would never encounter or even think of otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned St. Paul. I'll share in a bit because I want to do a little aside here. But I had spent some time studying along this sort of spiritual journey I was on. I was studying different views of death, right? I was looking at, the Epicurean view in ancient philosophy. I was looking at the Epicurean view of the soul and it being made of atoms and it being dispersed and all those sorts of things. I was looking at reincarnation views amongst philosophers like Plato. I was looking at resurrection and the various views, right? Some obviously, like Sadducees, didn't believe in resurrection, but the ones who did amongst the Jews. And as I was studying that, amongst the study I was doing, I started reading St. Paul, and and this is a little teaser for something I want to come back to after this next question. But basically, what I started seeing was I came to the conclusion that there was something either incoherent in the New Testament about resurrection, or there was a missing piece. And I could see kind of what that missing piece, what the shape had to be like, but I didn't have it. I was like,
Mhm.
there's something off here. But again, once I had discovered the essence energies distinction, all those sorts of things, all of a sudden I was like, oh, now the New Testament makes sense. And candidly, I don't think the doctrine of resurrection in the New Testament makes sense without the essence energies distinction. So that's a teaser. I'll come back to that. Before we continue down this road, I want to know, because I've never asked you this, I really don't know. I gave a little bit of a taste of how I ended up coming across the essence energies distinction, right? How I was wakened to it, why I studied it, what led me to your work, all that. But I'm just curious. I've never asked you, like, how did you get clued into this? Why did you pick this as an area of research? So tell me a little bit about that biographical side of this side of your research.
Yeah, well, for me, it does go way back because when I first converted to Orthodoxy in 1982, I was still in college. And I did kind of like you mentioned, I was reading Vladimir Lossky and John Meyendorff,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and Georges Florovsky were sort of
Yeah.
the most eminent, best known Orthodox authors whose works you could find in English.
Yeah.
And they all do talk about the essence energies distinction, particularly in St. Gregory Palamas,
Mm-hmm.
who, as you know, he's a 14th century author, kind of a late Byzantine
Right.
author. And he's the one who sort of thematized it and helped. He's the first person people think of now when they think of the essence energies distinction. And I was just stuck kind of at square one. Well, does this word energia you're talking about, does it really even mean energy? Is
Mm-hmm.
that really the appropriate translation? Because I already knew enough philosophy to know that this was a word that was coined by Aristotle. And in Aristotle, you never translate it as energy. It's usually either activity or actuality,
Mm-hmm.
in a sort of more purely metaphysical context, if it's contrasted to potentiality.
Right.
Um, and then, even if you read English translations of the Greek fathers,
Mm-hmm.
such as the Cappadocians in the fourth century, I mean, you mentioned St. Basil, I think.
Yeah.
Um, Often those translations will render that word activity or
Right.
operation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, so, the classic text in St. Basil, Epistle 234, where he says, um, his energies come down to us, but his essence remains beyond our
Right.
reach.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of English translations will say his operations come down to us,
Mm-hmm.
but his essence remains beyond our reach.
Right.
And that makes it sound very different and
Yeah.
actually much less startling, much less surprising, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, his operations, the things he does
Sure.
reach us, but his essence, of course, what's surprising about that?
Right. Right.
Uh, so I wanted to know if indeed this word comes to mean energy, when and how did that happen?
Right.
Um, and I quickly realized that none of these Orthodox authors had really even asked that question, much less tried to answer it. They
Right.
were also focused on that late Byzantine period
Mm-hmm.
because, they were writing as theologians trying to explain how Orthodox theology is different from Western theology.
Mm-hmm.
And so they naturally kind of fixated on Gregory Palamas, who was writing just about the time that Eastern Orthodox thought and Western Catholic thought were beginning to enter into really deep engagement with each other. And he was kind of a flashpoint, um, or at least he became one later. And I just had a different set of questions and a different starting point. I
Right.
wanted to know, how does it get from meaning what it means in Aristotle to what
Mm-hmm.
you're claiming it means in Palamas?
Right.
And
Right.
I wanted to fill in that trajectory.
Yeah.
So when I went to graduate school, I was actually, my original training was in physics, and I worked in physics for 6 years, reading Greek philosophy and the Greek fathers in the evenings. When I went back to grad school in '91 to specialize in ancient Greek philosophy, it really was with this question largely in mind. And like I mentioned, I then wrote the dissertation that became the first half of my book.
Yeah.
Um, and precisely to answer that question.
Yeah.
And um, not to go into too much detail, but as you know, I mean, you've read the book, and
Mm-hmm.
um, this is a question I try to pinpoint. And it turns out, well, there's in a way more than one answer because it depends what you mean by energy.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Sure.
that initially was a term in rhetoric,
Mm-hmm.
or at least that's how it initially entered the English language. Sir Philip Sidney, in his Defense of Poesy in the 16th century,
Mm-hmm.
and he's transliterating a term that you can find in Greek rhetoricians,
Mm-hmm.
where energia is the quality that a passage or description has of being particularly vivid and
Mm-hmm.
powerful.
Yeah.
And that's a kind of an adaptation of the way Aristotle uses the term in his rhetoric,
Mm-hmm.
although he doesn't use it to mean exactly that. Um, but so that's kind of how the concept begins to develop. But then, like you mentioned, with Alexandrian Judaism, to me is where it gets really interesting
Oh yeah.
because there you're talking about the energia, the activity of God.
Right.
And like this is in Philo, it's also in various fragments of other Alexandrian authors or even earlier than Philo. And the activity of God is distinct and unique in the way that it can enter into a creature
Hmm.
and vivify and empower that creature to do things the creature could not do otherwise.
Yeah.
And anything that does that precisely is an energy.
Yeah.
And St. Paul uses that word. Actually, he uses the verb energein and the noun energema, but they're all from the same root. In 1 Corinthians 12, where he's describing the gifts of the Spirit.
Right.
And so that essentially they are forms of divine energy, the gift of healing, the gift of prophecy, and also gifts like faith
Hmm.
and gift of teaching or what have you, that are not necessarily sort of supernatural, but
Right.
nonetheless they're forms of the presence of the Holy Spirit that empowers and vivifies and enlightens us when we're in that relationship to the Spirit, and that's receiving the divine energy.
Yeah.
It's just that English translations don't render it that
Right.
way,
Yeah.
and there's a history here.
Hmm.
It's because in the original Latin translations of the New Testament, they translate energia as operatio,
Hmm.
operation, and that just became the standard way of doing it in the West.
Hmm.
And so long through the whole Middle Ages, the West really didn't have access to the Greek anyway. There was nobody in the West who could read Greek for the most
Right.
part. So it
Hmm.
wasn't until the Renaissance that people even began getting access to those texts. And for a long time, it was very problematic for Catholic theologians. How do we even try to reconcile what these Greek fathers are saying with Latin scholasticism? And in the 16th century, this is something that Vladimir Lossky does talk about that I found really fascinating. There were scholastics in kind of this period of second scholasticism in Spain,
Hmm.
16th, 17th century, who just wanted to blanket condemn the Greek fathers as heretics
Hmm. Right.
because they taught that the divine essence is unknowable. And
Uh-huh.
that seems pretty clearly contradictory to the Latin belief in the beatific vision.
Right.
Um, so, at any rate, there's a long history here of, I think, misunderstanding. A lot of it due to the mismatch of language between Greek and Latin. The fact that there are certain concepts in Greek that are sort of native to the language that are very hard to convey in Latin or really any Western language, um, and as well as other factors, the fact that people in the Middle Ages didn't read Greek, and so you had this linguistic divide that prevented mutual comprehension
Yeah.
and kind of made the whole concept of divine energy become invisible in
Hmm.
the West,
Right.
even though it's right there in the New Testament.
Right.
And that's a tragedy that has affected and misshaped Western Christianity almost from the beginning. And I do think, to me, there's a kind of a sense of urgency to recover this and articulate it in a way people in the West can understand, make clear this is not just a matter of Eastern Orthodox, arcana, late Byzantine theology or something. It's in the New Testament,
Right.
and it's part of Christianity from the beginning. And if we're not aware of that or we're not incorporating it, then we're really missing out on something that's central to the
Yeah.
whole message of the gospel.
Well, you and I are trying to do our part to help with that, David, with that recovery. You more than me, I'm sure. But anyway, we'll see if anybody listens. But there's so many things that you touched on that I'm eager to talk with you about. I mean, you brought up Philo and the sort of the way in which Philo develops this distinction. And I think it's so interesting because it's not just the idea that it's, that the energies can be participated in or penetrated thing or something like that. But I think also in Philo, there's a concern for divine freedom. There's a recognition that will and act and, activity by the Hebrew God is very
Mhm.
different than a lot of the Greek gods or the Greek conceptions of God where, will is talked about, but it's not obvious there's choice or, any sort of relationality, in that sort of sense. And I think that's as much a part of what Philo is concerned with in drawing this essence energies distinction there. Unlike Aristotle, he draws the distinction between essence and energies, but if I'm remembering right in his metaphysics, he says explicitly that God's essence is
Mhm.
energia, right?
Yeah, right.
And so, like in the case of God, Aristotle's not concerned with drawing that sort of distinction,
Right.
whereas with Philo, it matters, right? It matters a
Mhm.
lot. to how he understands what's happening in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
And so there's things like that you touched on the ways in which the gifts of the Spirit, some of those that we wouldn't necessarily think of as supernatural, like teaching. I think that touches on some critical aspects of Eastern patristic anthropology and the ways the energies distinction works into the way the Eastern Fathers see the world and the connection between God and world, which I think is different than the traditional nature grace divide of the Latin West. I still want to talk about St. Paul and soteriology, right? The doctrine of salvation, how this plays in. But before I go into all these sort of deep waters, let me kick it over to you let's pretend we're talking to, somebody who has no concept of what we're talking about, right? They're hearing the words, essence, energies. Okay. They're gathering that this is important. They're gathering this is a history. They gather there's like metaphysical significance to it, whatever. But they're like, okay, but this is all new to me. Just give me a breakdown of like what on earth the essence energies distinction is, so I can have some level of, some footing as we start to delve into some of these other topics. Give us like a quick 101 on it.
Well, since you mentioned Philo, maybe I'll just kind of build on that. That Philo, I mean, this I think is to me very helpful to understand what the word essence means as these authors use it. The episode in Exodus 33 where Moses goes up into the darkness on Mount Sinai, and he speaks with God and he pleads with God, show me yourself.
Yeah.
And God says, no man can see my face and live, but I'll put you in the cleft of the rock and I'll pass by and you will see my backside. Well, Philo kind of paraphrases that as Moses is pleading with God to reveal to me your ousia, your essence, and what he means by that, and that as you read this passage in Philo, is sort of who you really are, you as a person. And it is different from someone like Aristotle. For Aristotle, the essence of something, you define it, or something you can define by identifying the genus and the differentia.
Yeah.
And it's sort of the intelligible content of that species or that type of being. But it doesn't have this sense of sort of the deep personal inner core. I think that arises with Judaism because God in the Bible, of course, is very different from the prime mover or the Stoic logos or the Platonic good. He's personal and he has character, you might say. There are things that he loves and things that he hates. And he gives commands, and sometimes the reason for the commands are not clear, but they're part of building a relationship to him as you would with any person.
Yeah.
And you, in that relationship, you're keenly aware that the deeper I go, the more I come to know God, the more there is that I don't know. You might say that the more there is of him, I realize is utterly beyond me. And I think that's a lot like a relationship with another human being. That the better you get to know someone, the more you realize the depth that's there and sort of the hidden depth that is always going to be unknowable, even though you engage with it and you know the person well through what the person does. Well, I think that's sort of the relationship to God that just naturally emerges from the Old Testament and also the New Testament. The question is how to articulate that. And so Philo already was using the word ousia with this connotation of sort of the deep inner personal core that is unknowable in itself. And for him, he uses the word power, dunamis in Greek, for the thing of God or the aspect of God, the action forth of God, acting forth of God that is present and knowable to us, at least to some extent. Occasionally, he'll also use the word energia, but it's less common for him.
Sure.
For St. Paul in the New Testament, that becomes sort of the go-to term, I think.
Right.
And so we mentioned the gifts of the Spirit. Just mention one other passage in St. Paul that I think is kind of indicative of this, where he refers to himself in Colossians 1:29. He says that the energia of God is being energumene, and that's the passive form of the verb, and being realized and made effective within me, within my ministry in the gospel. And so he's aware of himself and what he does in spreading the gospel as God's energy at work within him, being realized and made effective within him.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that does not mean that he's a puppet and God is pulling the strings.
Mm-hmm.
What it means is that his own free acts have become in this relationship also God's acts.
Mm-hmm.
They become the vehicle through which God is acting, even though it's also Paul himself freely acting.
Mm-hmm.
So that's synergy. That's the free cooperation and coalescence of
Mm-hmm.
energy between God and man. And that's a theme that you can find actually running throughout St. Paul.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really foundational for all later thought, at least in the Greek speaking tradition. Um, and so, anyway, if you just take that concept of energy with the concept of essence that's already there in Philo, that's the essence energies distinction.
Mm-hmm.
The essence is the deep inner personal core that is unknowable to any creature.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the energies are how that essence is manifested to us through God's action, including the actions by which he empowers and vivifies us as creatures.
Yeah.
And so we can know those divine energies through direct personal participation
Mm-hmm.
in God's own active life, you might say.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So a couple of analogies that I'm particularly fond of to help people grasp this, and you can weigh in and see if you think I'm misrepresenting anything with any of these. I'll sometimes talk about, let's say we have a musician, right? We have Bach here. And it's like, oh, David Bach, he's a creative musical genius, right?
mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
and you say, okay, well, that's great. I know what the word musical means. I know what genius means. So I have an analytic sort of abstract concept of what that means, but I don't have any tangible understanding of what that means that Bach is a musical genius. And the clearest way to show you is to say, well, have him compose, have him play. And now that that starts to express itself, that becomes an outward articulation or expression of what's within. But no particular expression exhausts it, right? He plays one movement. Yeah, that shows you a dimension of what's within, that's inaccessible, that creative genius that's now become accessible to you,
mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
But it's not the whole of it, right? It's just one
Right.
articulation. And that's why you could study Bach's, musical career for your entire life and never sort of exhaust it because there's still more underneath it. You're just dealing with all of these different articulations. And so on the one hand, the articulation is an extension of, right, that which is within Bach, but it's not the whole of it. And there is a distinction between that underlying wellspring and the particular, sort of articulation of it. Just like for me, right? I'm an artist, right? And back here, I have paintings back here that are,
Mm-hmm.
articulations of that artistic skill set. Those are those artistic skills I have, but they're not exhaustive, right? Just looking at those, studying those, tell you something about it, but it doesn't sort of plumb the depths of the whole. So that's one of the analogies that I like to use. Obviously, the Eastern Fathers have their own analogies, right? One of the famous ones is metal and fire. This just shows up again and again and again, where they talk about, well, and this goes to the participation aspect, and that's part of what you're getting at with Paul, because I think, and this is one of the things I want you to speak on, is that I think there's sometimes a tendency to treat this almost in a sort of purely descriptive as opposed to an ontological sense, right? That there's something substantive about this distinction, right? So when the Eastern Fathers will talk about this transference or this participation, they'll use examples like in flame metal, right? Or they'll talk about an iron rod that is put into fire and then it
Mm-hmm.
begins to glow and burn and it's removed and it's still glowing and burning. And now the iron is still iron, right? But something of the fire, right? The expression
Mm-hmm.
of that nature, right? The burning and the heating, the heating and the lighting energies, right? Expressions of the nature have actually taken up resonance and been transferred to the iron. And the reason I find that one, the way I like to always tweak that to help explain somebody like Paul and the very thing that you're talking about him being energized, is if you, rather than just make it generic iron, you make it a branding iron, right? You say, well, we have this branding iron, we heat it to the point that it's burning, we take it over to a cow, we brand, the cow. Well, how distant does the fire feel to that cow? It doesn't feel distant at all. And if you ask the question, who is burning or what is burning the cow? Is it the iron or is it the fire? And the answer is both. The iron is what brings the fire near to the cow. The fire is what's supplying the energy that is burning the cow. And yet at the same time, the brand itself is shaped. Its articulation is shaped by the branding iron. So they really are both doing the work, right? The activity, the burning, the branding of the cow is being done by both of them simultaneously. And that's that synergy that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And the reason I like those analogies is because there's always a temptation to, as you said, just make it operation, right? Like make it just some sort of descriptive, outward, non-ontological sort of event, as opposed to what they've, certainly people like Philo and then St. Paul, especially, and then the Eastern Fathers, they seem to actually see these energies as in some ways substantive, right? Substantive extensions of what's underneath.
Yeah. Well, yes, because of that participatory aspect. And you're right to draw that distinction. I mean, many of the divine energies we can know through observation. Mm-hmm. The very creation of the world is a divine energy, that it's an expression of God.
Yeah.
And we see a great deal about God within creation. We see the harmony and the beauty and the creativity and the overwhelming power. But it's a different thing to actually participate in divine energy.
Right.
And that comes about through obedience, first of all. And the way the fathers think of it. So Greg of Nyssa has a wonderful homily on the sixth beatitude, the one, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God.
Right.
And he actually draws this distinction in that homily because he says, yes, you can come to know God the way that we come to know an artist through studying the artist's works.
Right.
And there's value in that. And that's in fact a wonderful thing to do, but it's not the best and the highest.
Right.
The best is to see God within yourself,
right,
in the purified heart.
Yeah.
And he takes that verse, that Jesus says, the kingdom of God is within you. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people translate it among you. It's actually ambiguous in the Greek, and who mean, but he takes it definitely to mean within you, because he thinks it's referring to the image of God that is within all of us. And he says that image has been overlain and obscured by the passions, by our tendencies toward, lust and anger and jealousy and greed and sloth. Kind of list the 7 deadly sins, and you've got most of them. And those are so deeply rooted. And so, the reason they talk about the passions instead of sin, in general, is because sin, you tend to think of as something you do.
Right.
Murder is a sin and lying is a sin. But the passions are the tendencies you have to do those things, even if you never happen to have an opportunity or a provocation that would lead you to murder.
Right.
If you have wrath within you that could possibly find expression in that way, that's just as bad.
Right.
That's why Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount that whoever says to his brother, "You fool," is how does he put it? Is almost equivalent.
Yeah, he's committed murder in his heart. Right.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's because he's looking to what's in the heart and not just the actions, which are kind of the contingent byproduct of what's in the heart.
Right.
And so St. Gregory says, well, what does it mean to be pure in heart? It means that those passions have been purified away. They've been washed away. And so that radiant divine image that's always been there is now visible.
Yeah.
And you sort of, know it within yourself. This is what he thinks Jesus means when he says the kingdom of God is within you. And Gregory says, well, then how do you do that? I mean, what could that possibly be like to begin to achieve that kind of purity? He says, well, that's why we have to obey the commandments of the gospel. When Jesus says these really hard things. Whoever looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. He's warning us about the power of the passions, but he's also giving us disciplines to follow,
Right.
a whole way of life, really, to follow, in which those passions gradually lose their hold on who we are.
Yeah.
And this doesn't happen all at once, and maybe it never happens entirely in this life.
Hmm.
But the saints are precisely the people in whom this purification from the passions is visible and manifest.
Right.
And that's why you see holiness in the lives of saints. That's just something categorically different from moral goodness. Moral goodness, again, relates to action. And we have ways of assessing it in terms of generosity and self sacrifice and so forth that are all good things. But that's quite different from holiness. Holiness is weird. You read about the saints, or if you've ever maybe encountered a monastic elder, I've encountered just a very few that have given me this sense. There's something here that is not from this world,
Right.
and
Right.
it's often quirky. They're not people who follow the categorical imperative with great strictness.
No. Oh no.
No, they can be
That's
kind
a
of in
that's
your
a
face.
Kant joke for anybody who's unfamiliar with Immanuel Kant's philosophy.
Uh,
Yeah.
yes. So, at any rate, I'm digressing, but
No,
the larger point that I think you're right to make is that the divine energies can be known through participating in them, and that's possible because God made us for that.
right.
When it says we're made in the image and likeness of God, that's what we're that's what it's all about. This is how we realize that divine image within.
Yeah.
It's by participating in the divine energies through that kind of relationship of synergy
Hmm.
that I think is wonderfully illustrated in St. Paul,
Hmm.
but also in many other saints' lives.
Yeah.
Uh, so,
Now, I think this, and I think this is so relevant to so many different issues. I talked about, for example, I did an article, a couple of different articles on divine revelation, and when I traced divine revelation, the discussion it actually starts in Augustine. You can see this, sort of what I'm about to describe being sort of the precedent for it being put out there in Augustine's De Trinitate. And then what happens is in the Enlightenment and modernity, it just continues to echo, which is that revelation is basically that God shows up to your eyes, speaks to your ears. He's an object in front of you. It's all extrinsic data being given to you. And then what happens is like now you're a prophet because you've been given information from God, and you go and you relay that information, and God will work a miracle to convince people that you're a prophet. And that's kind of the way revelation is treated in
mhm.
the modern discussion in the West. Whereas what's fascinating is exactly what Gregory of Nyssa is talking about: is that in the Eastern Fathers, so much of revelation is actually about participation. It's not extrinsic information about, not extrinsic observation. It's all participation where there is an actual partaking of God. God is within the prophet, right? He is energized by the prophet. In some ways, his knowledge, I mean, this stood out to me that when Basil is talking about the work of the Spirit, right? He starts to talk about that, he talks about all these sorts of things that you might expect, right? In terms of fruit of the Spirit, but then he includes like knowledge of things hidden and foreknowledge of the future and things like that. And you start to realize in these contexts, Basil means like when if a saint or a prophet or somebody has some sort of secret knowledge or knowledge about the future, that's actually God's own knowledge taking up residence within them. They're participating in it in some way. And what I find so fascinating about that as a point about revelation is just that there actually is a means of verification, right? You start by hearing the words of the prophet, but you can taste and see yourself. And over time, through participation in God, realize that these things are true because you're participating in the same realities the prophet is.
Yeah.
And that's a very different concept. But it also goes to this whole, you talked about knowledge of God and Gregory of Nyssa and everything that he said about that. And I think it's very interesting that, in a lot of the Davidic Psalms where it talks about knowing God, it's actually using the Hebrew knowing of, intimacy, right? That Adam knew his wife. and it's using these sorts of interpenetrating, like intimate, forms of knowledge having to do with God. And that's really the thing that we're sort of being invited into, right? Is some form of participation in God that's much, much, much deeper. Now, I think that's all fascinating. Let's talk a little bit, since we're talking about participation, let me tell you a little bit. I'd given this bit of a teaser about something in the New Testament that had awakened me to what I thought was a problem. And I think it's an unsolvable problem unless you have the essence energies distinction. And I want to use that as a way into the discussion of how this relates to salvation and how the Eastern Fathers understand the human condition, and then also how they understand the remedy to that condition that you're talking about. So I had mentioned that I had started studying, views of death and the afterlife, reincarnation, resurrection, things like that in ancient writers. And one of the things that struck me as very strange in St. Paul, the first thing that struck me as strange, is that when he talks about that Christ, having been raised from the dead, cannot die. He doesn't say won't die. He says cannot die, right? Like he makes it this sort of necessity, right? Like that it's impossible. And I thought, that's weird, because didn't Lazarus die? Didn't the widow's son who was resurrected die? And all that sort of stuff. And I thought, I don't think Paul is right. Like, I don't understand like how this is even coherent. But then I started finding these other anomalies in Paul, like that Christ is, the firstborn from the dead. And it's like, well, again, like people have been resurrected. So what's going on? And that's what clued me in that, the New Testament is replete with distinctions between types of resurrection. It's even when Christ talks about future judgment and being raised, he talks about the resurrection unto judgment, and the resurrection unto life, or something like that. And I was like, okay, so they're even using different words. And then in the Apocalypse of John, right, book of Revelation, you have like two different types of resurrection. And, those who participate in this one are blessed, right? Like that's the one you want to participate in. And I started thinking, well, that's where I was convinced. I was like, okay, so there has to be, clearly in the New Testament, there's some sort of categorical distinction. Not all being brought back to life is the resurrection, unto life. And it was obvious because St. Paul also said, and this jumped out to me, that he talks about, all these things that he does and that he hopes to participate in the resurrection. Right. And I thought, well, if we're all going to have it, no matter what, like the hope would be, I hope I'm going to be judged righteous and saved, not that I hope to participate in it. So what on earth is Paul talking about, right? What's to hope for if it's an absolute necessity? And over time, what became clear to me was that, first of all, reanimation is not resurrection, right? That those are two different things. And I noticed later, when I looked at the raising of the icons of the raising of Lazarus, it's the raising, right? Eros. It's not the resurrection of Lazarus. And so that stood out to me. And then also the righteous and the wicked don't participate in the same type of resurrection. They're both resurrected in some sense, but what the righteous experience is different. And from what I could tell from Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, everything about the resurrection had to do with putting off corruption. It was metamorphosis of some kind, right? Putting off corruption, putting on incorruption, being buried one way, dying one way, being raised another way, different types of glory. He's talking about all these sorts of things that have to do with metamorphosis language. And I thought, okay, so I'm getting the general puzzle pieces, but I didn't have a concept of what that means. You're putting off corruption for incorruption. How would that happen? And then, of course, Peter has this notorious statement in one of his letters where he talks about escaping the corruption that has come upon the world due to lust because, by partaking of the divine nature. And I was like, okay, so here Peter talks about, the remedy to corruption The participation of, the remedy to corruption is partaking of divine nature. And when I came across that, I was like, I have no idea what that means or how to work that out. But once I discovered the Eastern Fathers and this idea that you could participate in God, partake of his divine energies, all of a sudden I thought that's the only way to make sense of all this stuff. It's the only way to make sense of it is because also one of the things Paul says is he says God alone is immortal. And then Jesus goes ahead and offers you immortality, right? He talks about how the life that is in him is from the Father, right? And he has the life in him, and you won't come to him to have life. And so all of this started to make sense because all of a sudden I was like, wait a second. So in the New Testament, you're being offered eternal life. You're being offered immortality. You're being offered life, categorically different type of life, right? Lewis and Mere Christianity would make it like Zoe versus Bios, right? Two different types of life here. And so you're being offered this thing that seems to be uniquely God, right? If we take Paul seriously, God alone is immortal, but he's going to give you immortality. He's giving you something that is unique to him, right? Something that is his own. Peter is saying the same thing in corruption. You get some share of God, right? You're going to partake of something that is uniquely God. And that all of a sudden makes sense why Paul would say, like, Christ having been raised, right? Like, can't die, because now we're talking about an ontological shift, right? We're talking about a shift where, his humanity has now partaken of something divine, which is incorruption, immortality, which means immune to death, right? It's not just longevity, right? It's actually in some way a metamorphosis into something new. And so that was the first thing that really awakened me to this, was the study of resurrection and these oddities in the New Testament that, from what I could tell, did not make any sense unless you have some way of talking about partaking of something that is uniquely divine, partaking of divine immortality, partaking of the divine nature. And so that's what awakened me to it at first. It was actually that anomaly in the New Testament through that study. So talk to us a little bit about, and I think that's overtly how the Eastern Fathers understand it. That's central to how they see, what the gospel is and what's being offered to humanity. So speak to us a little bit about, the human condition from the Eastern perspective, the human condition you already have. You talked about these passions and things like that. But what is the gospel? I mean, according to the Eastern Fathers in this way, what's the human condition? What is the enemy, right, of death, and what is it, that we're being offered by way of remedy?
Well, of course, the first thing for me that comes to mind is the work on the Incarnation by St. Athanasius.
Yeah.
I actually teach that often in my ancient philosophy class. I like to read Celsus, the first pagan critic of Christianity. And Celsus had a real simple argument that that to show that Christianity is absurd and actually needs to be destroyed. It was that if you think that God is troubled by the evil in the world, that is itself blasphemous, because you're saying either that God is ignorant and he hadn't known about all the evil here, or that he's troubled by it and he shouldn't be troubled because it's inevitable. For Celsus, as a Platonist, evil is simply something that follows inevitably from matter.
Yeah.
And it's the fact that the world is made of matter, that it's a sensible reality, and therefore an imperfect imitation of the ideal archetype that makes evil inevitable. And in fact, Celsus even says that the amount of evil in the world is fixed. It never changes. It just takes different forms because the amount of matter is fixed. And of course, God knows all of this, and therefore he's not troubled by evil. And there would be no possible motive for him to want to become man to save us, because he knows there's no way any of this is ever going to change. Not to mention that becoming man would also be unworthy of God, and to believe in that is kind of a further level of blasphemy. But anyway, Celsus, it's all very consistent.
Yeah.
And it lies in identifying matter as and materiality as the cause of evil. And of course, Christianity just has a fundamentally different view that
Mm-hmm.
goes back to Genesis, where everything that God creates, God sees that it is good
Mm-hmm.
at each stage of the creation. And that's the material world. That's nature that God makes is good of its own nature,
Mm-hmm.
and matter, therefore, is created by God to be something good. And of course, the cause of evil, as you keep reading Genesis in chapter 3, is in us. It's in our own rebellion and our unwillingness to heed God. And
Mm-hmm.
once we do sin, the other thing that's very, to me, very striking in Genesis 3, um, one of the fathers, Saint Simeon the New Theologian, says the fall was not actually when they sinned, when they ate the fruit. The fall was when they refused to repent
Mm.
and they hid themselves from God instead of turning to Him and saying, "What have we done? Help us, O Lord."
Yeah.
They didn't do that. They hid themselves, and then when He finds them, they justify themselves. Each Adam blames it on Eve, and Eve blames it on the serpent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and He says that's when the fall occurred. It's when they turned from God in shame instead of turning to Him in love.
Right.
So um, anyway, that's the source of evil. And therefore, what needs to change is us. It's
Mm-hmm.
not the materiality of the world. In fact, the materiality is blessed by God.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that we were kind of getting at a few minutes ago, talking about participation. That when the fathers talk about participating in the divine energies, that ultimately is a physical change that takes place. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the body itself is deified
Mm-hmm.
in that process. Now, not visibly for most of us, but again, you turn to the saints. There are many, many incidents of saints glowing with the uncreated light
Mm-hmm.
or having other visible manifestations of that divine power, that divine energy. Even back in the book of Acts, people were healed by St. Peter's shadow,
Mm-hmm.
just in his passing by. He
Right.
had such a powerful presence of that divine energy within him.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, uh, if you ask what then is salvation,
Mm-hmm.
salvation is the full transformation, the full deification of the human person, body as well as soul,
Mm-hmm.
through participation in the divine energies.
Mm-hmm.
And it begins in this life, but this is just the beginning. And the fathers also teach that even in the afterlife, there's an unending progress, deeper and deeper into the knowledge and the love of God that they understand as this ever growing participation in the divine energy.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and it never attains to the knowledge of the divine essence, but the energies are the ever fuller manifestation of God as He is, as we can know and apprehend Him.
Yeah.
Um, so anyway, that's why that's essentially what Athanasius says when he replies to Celsus and people like Celsus,
Mm-hmm.
uh, is that God creates the world out of nothing. Therefore, everything God made is good. Therefore, matter is good.
Mm-hmm.
Matter is blessed by God. And part of what God the Son does in becoming incarnate is to deify and sanctify the human body
Mm-hmm.
and to enable us to share in that deification.
Yeah.
Uh, so, at any rate, that's probably more than you were asking for, but
No, no, no. That's great. And I think it actually goes to a really important feature of just basic worldview question is in fact, evil. And here I don't mean the problem of evil. I mean the basic question of, do you think evil is evil, right? Because when it comes to that, you talked about, the Plotinian sort of notion that, you basically have two principles, right? You have God, and as he emanates, then you start to have matter take on these forms, and it's a replica of these forms that are within the
Mhm.
divine mind. But because it's inherently unstable, it's always mutating, right? It's imperfect, and it's filled with corruptions, and it drags things down, and that just makes it sort of inevitable. And so you obviously have that view. You have these sort of more pantheistic views that suggest that, well, it's only, we just call things evil because we find them unpleasant, but from the divine perspective, it's all fine. And so you make God beyond good and evil. And then, of course, you have the Christian view, which says something has gone wrong, right? That things ought not to be this way. And I, of course, find it most compelling that, what's interesting is that there is this thing in the human heart that just insists that the world ought not to be this way, right? Even atheists who, would claim that there's no God and it's all chaotic matter, they ask, like, why, right? They get angry that things are not this way. And there's no point in asking why, right? If you don't have this sort of innate sense that somehow the world is supposed to be just and good and fair, and it's not, right? There's something that the human mind just can't come to grips with. And the question would be, why would the human mind actually be bent on that conviction if the world is actually not supposed to be that way? And I think it comes out not just in experiences of pain, it comes out in our self-justification, right? You talked about Adam and Eve, like needing to come up with a justification. It wasn't me, it was her. It wasn't me, it was the serpent, right? And I think that's because, again, as part of that innate human instinct, that intuition that's deeply woven into us that says the world ought to be this way, not that way, it becomes equally difficult for us to come to grips, not just with the idea that the world has gone wrong, right? That something has happened that ought not to happen, but it's even more difficult to come to grips with the idea that I did it. The thing that has gone wrong in the world is me, right? And that's one of the reasons self-justification is such a strong impulse, because the alternative is to accept, yes, something has gone wrong in the world and I did it. The reason the world has gone wrong is because of choices I have made. And we just, that is so contrary to, that's such a gut-wrenching reality to face. And that instinct is one of the many reasons I'm so convinced that Christianity is correct in its diagnosis of evil, that our world is not just what it is because there's either two warring forces that are eternal and opposed, forces at war, like in metaphysical dualism, or because matter is inherently evil, or that God's above good and evil and we're just talking about pleasure and pain. I'm convinced that that icon of God that has an innate understanding of what the world is supposed to be like is the thing that impels us to ask why, is the thing that impels us, not to say that God wants us to do that, but to self-justification, because we can't come to grips with the idea that we are the things that have set the world, on the wrong path or something like that. So I think that's critical. I think it's critical to see that the world, exactly the sort of thing that you're talking about, in order to diagnose the human condition. And then once you've gotten there, once you've become convinced that there are things that are not right in me, right? There's something twisted about my nature. How do I remedy it? And this is where I was, I talked about that. I think the essence energies distinction is an important feature of anthropology. And one of the things that I so marveled at is that, and there's so many things I want to get to. I don't want to get too bogged down with all of them, but I could talk to you all day on this topic, David. But one of the things that happens in the Latin West is, and largely because of the Pelagian dispute, is this distinction between nature and grace, and this idea that somehow nature just is inherently incapable of completing itself, and therefore you have the natural realm, and creatures are incapable of their own accord to do anything that's pleasing to God, and that's why you need this supernatural sort of input from God. But then for some reason, God is not duty bound to give that, and so now that's where you get this sort of arbitrariness of God offering grace to redeem people that gets you into conversations about predestination and all this sort of stuff. But one of the things that I found so fascinating in the Eastern Fathers is they seem to think that we have a natural and unseverable connection with God. So yes, the divine energies are supernatural. They're God, right? But there is nothing more natural than for an icon of God to reflect those energies, to participate in those energies. So I remember being so struck when I read the life of St. Anthony, and Anthony says in there that the soul is twisted by the fall. And if you just untwist it, it naturally does what it is made to do, which is deify the individual.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was so striking to me because I realized, okay, I wouldn't want to call it a nature grace divide. There's a creature creator divide, sure. But this creature, as an icon of God, is made to participate in God. In fact, as an icon of God, this is something that Plato talks about, right? That, the very notion of image, if you're talking about a substantial image as opposed to like a reflective or like a negative image, like a shadow, an image is inherently referential. It is the image of, right? Just like somebody is the father of, right? Or the son of. These are referential, properties. And so being the image of God, we have a direct connection with God that can't be broken. It can be twisted, distorted, suppressed, buried underneath passions, underneath distorted anthropology. But that connection can't be broken. That's what you are, right? And that's where, Gregory of Nyssa, same sort of thing, where he interprets the lost coin parable from Christ, where the coin gets lost in the house and the lady cleans out the house to find the coin and then celebrates. Which I always thought was a funny story because I was like, doesn't she spend more than the coin on the celebration? But um, but but in that story, Gregory Nyssa understands the house to be humanity and the coin to be the image of God that's buried underneath the passions. And Christ comes in and cleans it out and unearths that. And so there's something in the Eastern Fathers where the insistence is, yes, you're right to be troubled by the twisted, distorted nature. You're right to recognize that something's gone wrong. But what has gone wrong is exactly what you talked about, right? Those passions that have clouded and buried and crippled that image. And everything about, the Eastern Fathers and the teachings of Christ and Eastern Orthodoxy is about a way of life, as you said it earlier, of sort of clearing away those passions so that
Yeah.
that image can do what it was made to do in the first place, which is partake in God, right? Participate in God. So,
Well, I think it's very important that when they think about God or they name God, the first name that always comes to mind is the good.
mhm.
Um, in the West, more often it's being.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm.
in Augustine, of course, that's a major theme,
Yeah.
and later people like Aquinas kind of pick up that from Augustine. But in the East, it's more often the good, and this has a huge influence on anthropology, like you were mentioning. There's a wonderful passage in Saint Basil in his work, The Long Rules, which is kind of a
Mhm.
question and answer format.
Right.
And the question posed is, um, teach us how to love God.
Mm.
And Basil's answer is, you don't need to learn how to love God. You already do love God because you love the good.
Mhm.
He says the love of God is as innate to us as the love of light or air or human companionship.
Mhm.
These are things that we just innately do love and seek. The trouble is when we seek them the wrong way.
Right.
And so we seek uh, the good, the things that we think are good. And so often we're very mistaken. They're not truly good, or at least they're not good in the way that we're seeking them. And that's what the trouble is. And he says, so what we need is to have our innate love for the good directed by what he calls the school of God's commandments.
Mhm.
And the role of God's commandments in scripture is to direct that innate love that we have so that it's directed toward the true good and not the many false goods.
Mhm.
Um, and that makes a huge difference in the way you think about who you are as a person
Mhm.
and who other people are, the way you think about sin and right and wrong and so forth.
Mhm.
Um, there's not what you'll know, nowhere in there does he mention the will.
Mhm.
And as you know, in Augustine, he can't talk about sin without talking about the will
Mhm.
and how the will can be perverted. And, when there's this fascinating discussion in the City of God about, well, why did Lucifer fall?
Mhm.
Uh, when the way, at least Augustine envisions it, Lucifer was the angel of light,
Mhm.
and he was in the immediate, close proximity to God. He had no body, no bodily
Mhm.
passions. There was no one, there was no serpent or anything tempting him, of course. So what was it about him?
Mm-hmm.
The, and he was made an angel of light. So how could he fall? And Augustine's answer is, well, the will can just do that. The will can deliberately reject what the intellect knows to be good
Mm-hmm.
and just perversely, for no reason,
Mm-hmm.
choose evil instead.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that Augustine summarizes that, he says there is no efficient cause of an evil will. There's only a deficient cause. And here he's kind of playing with Aristotelian. Aristotle talks about the efficient cause being the cause that makes something occur. But Augustine then introduces this other term, a deficient cause,
Right.
the lack of something, namely the lack of divine grace that would have enabled him to stand firm. And God did give that grace to the other angels, but for inscrutable reasons,
Yeah.
he didn't give it to Lucifer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that's the predestination aspect. And that's kind of what you're driven to
Mm-hmm.
on this sort of an Augustinian view, where the will, for no reason, just spontaneously chooses evil. And the only reason some wills don't do that is because they were given a gift of grace by God that prevented them from doing so.
Yeah.
And God gives that gift to some and not to others.
Yeah.
Um, and, with all respect to Augustine, who is a saint in the Orthodox Church, and I don't mean to kind of load all the bad thoughts of the world on his shoulders, but this is a really pernicious view, because it leads you to think of people when they do bad, they've just got a bad will.
Mm-hmm.
And all we can do is sort of cordon that off from ourselves. We've got to, put them in prison, maybe execute them, do whatever we have to do so that we stay safe, because they're just bad apples.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and not that there's not any truth to that. I believe in having prisons, okay, but it's not the right way to think about what evil is. Saint Basil says no. Everyone is seeking the good. Everyone is seeking God.
Yeah.
And that's innate to us, and that cannot be destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
We're made in the image of God, and that image is always there no matter what.
Yeah.
What can happen is that in that seeking the good, because we're ignorant and we haven't been schooled in God's commandments, we do it in the wrong way. But there's always room for repentance, and there's always room for divine grace.
Mm-hmm.
Not that Augustine wouldn't allow that. I'm not trying to say this is all light and dark, but it does make a difference how you think about who we are
Mm-hmm.
as creatures who are capable of both good and evil.
Yeah.
And the will in general, is much, much less prominent, really, as a factor in Eastern anthropology,
Mm-hmm.
theological anthropology, than it is in the West. Um, Another thing, just going back to Greek and Latin for a minute, I noticed when I read, you can get this facing page of the New Testament edition of Greek on one page, Latin on the other
Oh,
page.
right. Mm-hmm.
And so, I like to read that. And it's really amazing. You look at the word voluntas, which
Mm-hmm.
is will, it's the
Right.
source of our word voluntary. In the Latin New Testament, it's all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept wondering, well, why am I seeing this word so much? And I started looking at the equivalent Greek term that it was translating. And there are about a half dozen different Greek words in the New Testament that all get translated by voluntas,
Mm.
or some cognate like voluntarius,
Right.
voluntary. And it gives you the impression, if you read, if you're someone like Augustine and you're reading the New Testament in Latin, you get the overwhelming impression that there's this thing, the voluntas, that really is what I am.
Mm-hmm.
And it's either good or it's evil.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and all I can do is try to achieve a good voluntas.
Yeah.
And that's just not in the Greek. It's not in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
It's an artifact of translation. But I think it had a big influence on the way he did think about good and evil, as I was mentioning,
Yeah.
for instance, when he talks about the fall of Lucifer.
Yeah.
And that filters down, that shapes the way that Western Christianity comes to think about these basic concepts. And you don't really realize how weird that all is until you get away from it and you're reading, the Greek fathers who just didn't think that way,
Right.
because they were reading the New Testament in the original Greek. And it doesn't present that as the fundamental explanation of who we are.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. I think this comes through a lot in just the different ways in which the Eastern Fathers talk about sin versus in the West. In the West, sin, and I think this is a very popular conception that's still present in a lot of Western Protestant thinking, Catholic thinking, where sin is probably primarily thought of as moral infractions, which means they're volitional. I recognize something is wrong and I do the wrong thing. Whereas in the Eastern Fathers, sin is much broader, right? It's anything that is sort of defective or wrong. I mean, Chrysostom in his treatment of Romans 5, I think explicitly is like, well, here I presume sin is used in reference to death, right? And like, so it's this much broader sort of thing where like, if I have a withered hand, right, to choose a story from the gospel, that's sin, right? That's death at work in my members. It's something that's ought not to be, something that's distorted that Christ, heals there. I want to jump over to another topic before I lose you, which is I want to talk a little bit, since you've brought up Will and you've brought up Augustine and you've brought up scholastics. I want to talk a little bit about the relevance of the essence energy's distinction to freedom, since we've touched on that topic. Because one of the issues that I ran into in my journey, I'd mentioned that I had sort of rejected and become an opponent of Western Christianity, the only Christianity I knew. And what I had embraced instead was process philosophy. I was a sort of wild-eyed, metaphysician, anti-Christian type who had really started. I was open to all sorts of things: pantheism, panentheism, right? That God and world are one giant organism. I was open to, like, of course, all the classical divine attributes are false. We're going to reject all of that sort of stuff. Omniscience, omnipotence, simplicity, all that, out the window. In terms of the Bible, maybe it's inspired by God, but certainly not, reliable, and, things evolve over time and all this sort of stuff. So I had, wildly sort of heretical views and knew they were heretical and reveled in it. My favorite book was just for the title, my favorite book was Charles Hartshorne's book, Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes.
Oh, yeah.
So I was a big Hartshorne fan. I loved it. But one of the things that stood out to me, and I want to provide the sort of scholastic context, and then I want to talk a little bit about something that I've heard you say in the past about divine freedom and these sorts of issues that I wrestled with. When I looked at medieval scholasticism, I saw a couple of different things. First of all, I did not recognize the God of the Bible in medieval scholasticism. And what I mean is God became this very abstract, sort of beyond being essence type thing, this metaphysical principle more than a person. There was, and yet that is not at all what I saw when I read, the Old Testament, the New Testament. And so there was this dissonance there where I'm like, I don't even recognize this deity that you're describing here in terms of that. But the other thing that I saw is I was convinced that medieval scholasticism was a series of backflips, metaphysical gymnastics, trying to come up with a way of holding on to what seemed to be very alien metaphysical principles from pagans and somehow reconcile them with all the things that we know we have to say as Christians anyway, even though those two things don't fit, round peg and square hole type thing. And I knew the arguments, but I was just unconvinced that they worked. So for people who are unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, you talk about this in Aristotle, East and West, the fact that, Augustine is won over by Platonism, right? And I don't say that in a negative way. I'm a big fan of Platonism myself. I'm convinced that it is filled with all sorts of truths, and even though it needs correction and all that sort of stuff. So I'm not an anti-Platonism guy, right? Big fan of Plato. But Augustine, I think, is won over in problematic ways by Platonism. So, he says explicitly in his Confessions, I read in these words of certain books of the Platonists, not with these exact words, of course, but with all the same meaning and intent. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so he says that explicitly. And he goes on and says, of course, what I didn't read in these pages is that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So he's acknowledging they don't know about the incarnation. But early Augustine, at least, and he retracts this later, But early Augustine is so enamored with Platonism. He says explicitly, I am convinced I will find nothing in the books of the Platonists that will conflict with Holy Scripture, right? Like, that's just how enthusiastic Augustine is early on. And again, later he's like, okay, I was young and naive. I was wrong. Okay. But the reason I think this is important is because one of the things that Plato goes to, Freudian slip, one of the things Augustine goes to through this sort of intellectual conversion is because he doesn't have the essence energies distinction. He also, I would say, based on De Trinitate, he doesn't have a proper, ousia hypostasis distinction. So he doesn't have that sort of thing drawn out. He ends up having a somewhat flattened metaphysic, where basically he has a very sort of Platonic view where you have like the good, which is God. You have the forms, which are these transcendent, idyllic essences, ideas of God, which in his 83 different questions, he says, yes, one day we'll see those. And then you have matter and you have the material copy. And that's sort of like his, that's his metaphysical cosmology that he's got there. And that creates certain problems of a variety of kind, right? It creates problems for the Trinity because multiplicity and number and, individuals are all based on matter and replica of, multiple instances or multiple replicas of certain forms. But also it gets you into this area with regard to divine essence, where how do you start to say certain things about God? If God is a pure essence. And so for people who are unfamiliar with this sort of metaphysical way of thinking, right? When you talk about a square, right, we can identify these essential properties. It's got 4 sides, equal length, right angles. And then we can talk about accidents, right, that emerge when you have a square in matter, like that it's blue or it's this size or that size, its location is here or there. So matter gives you all these accidental properties, but the form is just the essential properties. It's just 4 sides, right angles, equal length. And so when you get to God, first of all, you have just pure essence. So there are no accidents. You can't have accidental properties. You can't have properties which means you can't have properties that could be otherwise, right? You can't have properties that are subject to variation. You also can't have potential, right? Because in this way of thinking, this sort of flattened metaphysic, all potential is potential to mutate, to be otherwise, to have varying properties. So, and that's all germane to matter, right? That's only relevant there. So you can't have potentiality, right? To do certain things or to be otherwise. That would be mutation, and God's immutable, right? So that, that, and then you add to this simplicity where not only is God like a pure form, he's a super simple essence, right? According to the Confessions, I think it is, where he says that he's a super simple essence. And so whatever he is, he's just one thing too, right? Like, you don't have multiple, like his omniscience and his omnipotence. If we're going to look at Anselm's interpretation of this, right? They're all the same thing. Right. Like they're all, if you really understand what omnipotence is, you understand it's also omniscience, you understand it's also omnipresence, all this sort of stuff. Now, that creates some major problems for a religion that believes in things like divine freedom, that God makes choices, that believes that God knows things about the world, right? So with Aristotle, of course, there is a problem. Aristotle recognizes that if I pay attention to you and you start to move, there is something in me that mutates by perception. By perceiving the moving thing, I start to mutate. You change, I change by perception, right? Aristotle gets that. And so he's entirely open to the idea that maybe God doesn't have any perception of the world. Like that's fine. Like we can solve it that way. Aristotle doesn't have any Christian commitments that would contradict that. So that's fine for him.
Yeah.
But for a Christian who's like, no, God perceives the world, right? God interacts with the world. You have problems. How does God know us if we are mutating, changing things without him mutating? If God makes free choices, how do we say that he like choices that could be otherwise? Like, how do you say that without suggesting that he has some type of potentiality or whatever else? And from what I can tell, so much of medieval scholasticism are just metaphysical backflip upon backflip upon backflip, trying to stick the landing on saying all those things that Augustine said under that sort of Platonic, that simplified Platonic metaphysic, and still affirm the Christian stuff, that God has foreknowledge, he knows us, he makes choices, he interacts with us, right? All this sort of stuff. And candidly, as a process philosopher, I was just like, I don't think any of these solutions work. I saw them all as sleight of hands, right? So for just to take one example, foreknowledge, right? The problem of divine perception is a very real problem, right? It's true that as you move, I am moved, right, as a perceiver. And so Augustine tries to solve this by saying, okay, yeah, but foreknowledge. So the thing is, like, he has foreknowledge of the future, so everything's static and stable within God. And I looked at that and I was like, I don't think this solves the problem. I think for the person groping for a problem, solve to the problem, it feels pretty good. Okay, yeah, we've stabilized the thing, no shifting sort of stuff. But I mean, two basic questions, I think, highlight a problem with this sort of thing. The one is, I want to know if God knows when now is, because that seems to be a moving target. And are we just going to embrace that God is ignorant of when now is? And the other thing, so there's this phenomenological problem, of even if you're going to say that there's some sort of static truth set, there still is this shifting reality for temporal beings of when now is for you and me. And so it seems you either have to accept that or you have to make God ignorant of that. Another problem, I think, is that the sleight of hand is that it conflates eternal with necessary, right? So part of the problem is if you're going to say that, for example, I am a contingency. God could have created me or not created me. I make choices to move my arm or not move my arm. And when I do that, certain things become manifest and real that could have not been real had I made other choices, right? If you're going to say those sorts of things, even if it's static, its status ontologically is something that could have been otherwise. And so the fact of the matter, if you're going to have God knowing it, then you have a contingency within God, a certain type of knowing. God knows a certain thing, and had the thing been otherwise, he would have known otherwise. So you're sort of trying to solve the contingency problem by saying eternal, but eternal doesn't get rid of contingency. If it's still contingent, even if he always knew it, it's still a feature of God, his knowledge, that could have been otherwise if the thing had been otherwise. And if you're going to say the thing's contingent, then it had to be otherwise. And I'm convinced that the only way, if you're going to embrace this sort of Augustinian thing, the natural, most consistent, logical outworking of the Augustinian model is Spinoza. You need to get to the point where you just have to say, look, God doesn't have freedom. Everything that he does is just a natural extension of his own necessity. We don't have freedom. All we are is a natural extension of God's own necessity. And the solve to all these problems is there is no such thing as free will. There is no such thing as contingency. All that happens is absolutely necessary, period. Now, no Christian wants to say that, right? Like, people were worried, actually, in the medieval period that that's the ramifications of Thomas Aquinas's intellectualism. They were worried that he was bound to Mohammedan fate, right? That sort of thing. But the fact of the matter is, I do think that is the natural and logical outworking of that. But once I discovered the essence energies distinction, one of the many things that was so striking to me about it was that I realized that this seemed to offer divine freedom. It seemed that it was talking about a certain type of what we might call second order potentiality. I know, for people who don't know, right, there's different types of potentiality, right? If I don't know how to play the piano and I learn the piano, I'm drawing, I'm changing, right? I'm starting to acquire and manifest something that I didn't have before. I'm acquiring a new skill set. And that potential is moving into, some sort of being, right? Into some sort of reality. Second order potentiality is just dormant versus articulated, right? You know how to speak. You're not speaking in this moment. And once you start speaking, you don't acquire the power of speech. It's an expression or an articulation. And what I started to see is that because in the essence energies distinction, and correct me if you disagree, but I started seeing, first of all, it looked like this distinction allowed the Eastern Fathers to talk about God having what we might call, they don't call it that, but what we might call second order potentialities, right? The ability to make choices and do things that he, might not have done, and those are in no way modifies who he is underneath, right? That doesn't change what the essence is. And it's an expression of the essence, just like when Bach plays, right? It's an expression of the thing underneath, and it's free, and it's a free articulation of the thing. The fact that they placed knowledge of the world in the energies, from what I could tell, God's knowledge of the world is a free knowledge, right? He chooses to make things, and choosing to make those things knows those things, right? So it's not part of the essence, right? It is an energy that he knows us, being present, right? That he is present here with us. Well, he made us, and then he is actively present. I started seeing a way of solving these problems because they didn't have just essence, right? Whereas if you have just essence, I think you have to be a Spinozist. I think you have to be a necessitarian. And this is one of the things that I wanted to hear your thoughts on, because I've heard you say before, but I've never pressed you on it. And I don't plan to press you on it because I think you're exactly right. Was that I've heard you say that you said, I think that the essence energies distinction gives to process philosophers and open theists, folks who just don't find this other view of God palatable, plausible. I think it gives them everything they want in terms of a free, active, present, knowing, God. And I agree from experience, because like I said, the reason I went to process philosophy was because I thought this ends in Spinocism. That was my assessment of scholasticism. Not only did I think it was not, true to the God of the Bible, I thought the logical outcome of this, anybody who's like, you just follow it to its logical conclusion, you have to be Spinoza. And I was like, I'm not Spinoza. At the very least, I believe in moral responsibility, and I think it's true that means I have free choice, and so I just can't be a Spinozist. And once I did that, I saw no other way of going other than to just reject all the traditional divine attributes, because I had no concept of the essence distinction, and that's why I went down that road of process philosophy. But as I said, for me, the essence energies distinction unlocked an alternative. It unlocked a way of having all of those things, believing in divine freedom, believing in divine knowledge and interaction with the world, without abandoning traditional Christianity. It was just, I was abandoning Latin Christianity, right? But I was abandoning it in favor of what I'm convinced is an older, more true Christianity, something that has these distinctions from Paul and then is echoed in the Eastern Fathers. So my cards are on the table, David. Like, what do you think? Mm-hmm. What do you think?
Oh, well, I think we're on the same page here. Actually, Spinoza comes up briefly toward the end of Aristotle East and West, because there's a Thomist scholar, a guy named Francis Canassus, who wrote an article, sort of Aquinas or Spinoza,
right,
in which he addresses this problem very directly, and I give him credit for that. And he realized, Spinoza actually cites the doctrine of divine simplicity in the Ethics multiple times as one of his arguments, that there's really just one substance, God, and it just appears in all these different ways. But it's fully necessary, and there's no libertarian free will or anything like that. And so Canassus wants to rebut that, but he realizes that divine simplicity is a real problem if you want to have also divine freedom, like you were just saying. So he takes the view, which I've come to realize later is pretty common among Thomistic commentators, that, well, God is just a single, necessary, eternal act. And everything we name, as names of God, being and goodness and power and wisdom, creation, whatever, those are all different ways of naming that one act. And it's the same act, whether he creates the world or not.
Mm-hmm.
It's literally this. It's a numerically identical act,
Mm-hmm.
and I have to say I find this view so bizarre. I think I'm not able to really do it justice or to state it fairly. But I've read multiple Thomists saying this, and it still sounds really bizarre.
Yeah,
Uh, because what then is the world? The world is kind of like an epiphenomenon
it is. Yeah.
of an act that is exactly the same whether the world exists or not.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but anyway, the simple answer to that, if you are a Thomist, is no, that's not even Aquinas's view, because Aquinas is very explicit and emphatic that when God creates the world, he has a reason to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Namely, he wants to manifest and share his goodness.
Mm-hmm.
And if you say he has a reason to do this instead of that, you're supposing that this and that are actually different. Okay, they're different acts, and he has a reason to choose one rather than the other.
Yeah.
So I don't think this is even Aquinas's view, but it's the thing that they're driven to try to address this intractable problem
Mm-hmm.
of reconciling divine freedom with divine simplicity, the way it is understood in the West.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and not that we in the East, Orthodox, of course, we believe in divine simplicity,
Mm-hmm.
as just like we believe in all the other attributes,
Right.
goodness and power and wisdom. But all those attributes are ways that God manifests himself through his activity, through his energy.
Mm-hmm.
And in naming them, we name God as he appears and is known to us through his energies. We're not naming the divine essence.
Mm-hmm.
And so simplicity, as they consider it, is one of the divine energies.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the, just like goodness or life or being, one of the things that God possesses, you might say, in a transcendent way, in a way that's beyond our apprehension, but that then he shares with creatures, and in so doing makes himself known. And when he shares simplicity, that's when he gives creatures unity.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and Dionysius, the Areopagite, treats this under the kind of the heading of the procession of unity in the
Mm-hmm.
divine, his book, The Divine Names.
Right.
Um, so anyway, that's just about simplicity. We could talk more about that.
Mm-hmm.
But also, you're talking about time and how does God know what time it is now?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, he does. Because time is also a divine procession.
Right.
It's a way in which God manifests himself in sharing himself with the sensible world that he makes. One of the fathers defines time as the procession of the goodness of God in creating the sensible world.
Mm-hmm.
And time would not exist if he hadn't created. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
But what time is not exactly a creature. It's the way that God acts in bringing creation into being and sustaining it in being from moment to moment. And so it's an activity he performs. And of course, he knows his own activity.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, he knows today is May 17th and all the rest. He knows exactly what time it is, as well as what's happening at this time.
Mm-hmm.
And God is present within time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a huge aspect of this as well, that on that sort of scholastic view, where God is simply the first principle and pure essence and so forth, and eternity is another way of naming the divine essence. Time is simply a creature.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and Augustine definitely says that, and so do the scholastics.
Mm-hmm.
And what you end up then with is this sort of a chasm between the eternal God
Mm-hmm.
outside of time,
Right.
purely simple, self-identical, cannot be affected in any way. Um, and everything that's created that he brings into being, that's just a different and much lesser, of course, order of being.
Mm-hmm.
And time itself is simply a creature.
Yeah.
And you really experience this difference if you worship in the divine liturgy as an Orthodox, where time is understood as something iconic,
Mm-hmm.
something that is an image of a higher divine reality.
Mm-hmm.
And the divine liturgy is full of that iconic way of thinking, you might say.
Right. Right.
But St. Basil, when he talks about why do we worship only by standing on Sundays,
Mm-hmm.
he says it's because Sunday, which was the first day of creation, is an icon of eternity.
Mm-hmm.
And so we enter into that, we participate in that reality in standing in honor of the resurrection on when we worship on Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
And I could say more about all that, but anyway, that's just a brief point to kind of interject and agree with your larger point that the idea of divine simplicity and the resulting understanding of God that emerged in scholasticism, in my opinion, really was the prelude to modern atheism.
Yeah.
Because the doorway to modern atheism is exactly Spinoza.
Right.
Spinoza claimed that this God he talks about, he uses the name God, and
Yeah.
that's not God.
Mm-hmm.
That's simply nature,
Yeah.
given an honorific title,
Yep. That's right.
and with the assumption of full determinism built in.
Yeah.
And so, and of course, people were smart enough to recognize this.
Yeah. He
And
was accused of atheism,
yeah, right. And
despite
they
his
were right.
ethics starting with the proof for the existence of God.
There's no God there that you could worship or
Right.
you could come to know in anything like a personal relationship. Um, so it is atheism,
Yeah.
and the Enlightenment thinkers certainly recognize that. And from the Enlightenment on, scholasticism is a dead letter because people realize that's where it leads.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why modern thought becomes progressively more and more atheistic and secular,
Mm-hmm.
because they view, I think rightly so, they view that scholastic vision of God as a dead end.
Mm-hmm.
And they think that's all there is. They
Yeah.
think that's all there is that Christianity has to offer.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a
So
tragedy.
I would say with Spinoza, his pantheism and atheism are just two sides of the same coin, right? Like I think the difference is I've when I would teach classes on like the proofs for the existence of God, and I talk about the argument from contingency, right? And the idea that contingent things have to stand upon something that's not contingent, right? I would just ask students, well, does anybody disagree with this? And they'd say, well, there's atheists. So like, obviously. And I was like, do they? But I said, like, isn't matter can't be created or destroyed and all this sort of stuff, and I basically would show that isn't basic, the sort of scientism worldview, isn't it essentially just deifying nature, where nature has this necessity to it. It exists by necessity. It has all the necessary potentialities to bring about, all of the things. And then through sort of, it's not aware, self-aware, it's not intelligent, right? But it just sort of accidentally, sort of through happenstance, ends up producing all the things. And it basically that's what Spinoza does, right? It's just like Spinoza would just tell the contemporary scientific atheists, well, you should just call it God. That should be the conclusion, and this all men call God, right? So,
Yeah.
But I think you're right. Like that basically it's just like looking at two different sides of the same coin. Spinoza's pantheism versus contemporary scientific atheism. And I should clarify, like when I say that this is Thomas's view, like that, I think it ends in, I think you're right to say that that's not what Thomas wants it to end in, right? And that's why I said it's metaphysical backflips. So Thomas is clearly like he recognizes that his intellectualism, right? The idea that, for folks who don't know the faculty psychology, that the intellect makes an assessment of what is the best means to a given end, and then the will just has to blindly follow it. That's his intellectualism. The natural question is, well, if God is omniscient, right, doesn't he just inevitably know the best means to any given end and therefore has to do it, and therefore you end up in necessity? Thomas is clearly aware of this problem and he's trying to solve it. I just don't think any of his solves work. And clearly, like other voluntarists like Henry of Ghent and John Duns Scotus didn't think it works either, right? Which is why they went toward voluntarism. But I do think, so I don't mean to suggest in any way that the scholastics were willing to embrace and go the route of Spinoza's. I think, the entire scholastic project is an attempt to avoid going there. I just think intellectual honesty says they fail, that you can't avoid going there once you have their infrastructure, right? Their sort of metaphysical infrastructure. I'm very glad you brought up the time thing. I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole, ironically, because of time, that we're running out of time.
Yeah.
But I do think it's such a wonderful thing that you talked about. I highly recommend your article on the Eastern Fathers and time, which is an excellent excellent piece treating that topic. Um, and I think it's such a fascinating thing because one of the things that it highlights that we don't have time to dig into is the fact that, in addition, you mentioned that, time is in some way that there's this procession. It's not strictly speaking a creature, right? I
Mhm.
believe in that article you make comparisons with the Timaeus and the moving picture of the forms and things like that. But also then eternity is a divine energy. So it's interesting. Pseudo Dionysius says the angels are eternal. And in the simplistic way, people they think like, well, there's time. And then if you're outside of time, right, you're eternity, right? You've always been like God. And so if they read Pseudo Dionysius say the angels are eternal, it would sound like he's saying they're not created. But he clearly means they're created. He just means they participate in this divine energy called eternity. So these are just two different ways of experiencing reality. We're organisms, right? So we experience reality in one way via time. They're spirits who are not organisms. So they experience reality in this other way. And yet eternity is not static. That's another thing, is that like there's this tendency in the West, because there's like, well, there's time and then there's God who's outside of time and everything's static, to think of eternity as static. But as you've even pointed out before, I've heard you say this in conversations before, you're like, well, in the book of Revelation, time stops, but things keep happening.
Oh yeah.
Right. And the thing is, like,
Mm.
that would make no sense if eternity meant stagnation, right?
Right.
Everything freezes without time. But if what you start to see is what the Eastern Fathers have in mind, which is that there are different modes of expression, of the divine creativity. There are different types of beings who experience reality in different ways. Then it makes sense to begin to talk in that way. It begins to make sense that beings who are meant for eternal life, who are supposed to be undergo metamorphosis, and who are supposed to partake of God and put off certain ways of being for another way of being, would exit time into a different mode of being called eternity, right? Something like that. All of these things start to make sense, and it opens up all sorts of intriguing possibilities. I think intriguing also in terms of creation account type stuff, but we won't digress on that. Um,
Mhm.
but one of the things I do want to touch on, and we'll end on this because I think we've gone probably over time for what I intended to hold on to you for. Um, but you brought up simplicity. You mentioned to me outside of this conversation, you mentioned to me that you've been working on an article related to divine simplicity in the Eastern Fathers, which I'm very jealous of. I wanted to be have first mover advantage on that, but you beat me to it, so that's fine. Um, I will build on your work as I have in the past. So, David, you've already
Yeah.
touched on simplicity. I want to just ask you just a specific question, just to sort of scratch the surface of it, because we don't have time. It would be a whole long conversation unto itself. But so I'll just ask a couple of sort of specific questions, and then we can wrap up. Um, with simplicity, one of the things that I noticed, and I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on this. I had noticed, first of all, it seemed, if I'm remembering right, I think it's in his Contra Eunomius, where Gregory of Nyssa like talks about the fact that, like, of course, the essence is simple, but there's several hypostases. So first of all, you find that sort of thing. You find in Basil, I think it's Epistle 234, the one that you mentioned, where he explicitly rejects the sort of Anselmian notion that all the divine attributes, which in the Eastern Fathers, attributes are actually energies, are identical, right? He's like, well,
Mhm. Yeah.
obviously, all the different things God does, his love and his wrath, are like two different things, right? Like, and so he will say the essence is one, but the energies are many, right? That exude from it. And so when reading the Eastern Fathers, it became very clear to me they did not have that collapsed ontology that I described with Augustine, which ends up, re-articulated in Aquinas or in Anselm, and then just becomes normative in so much of scholastic thought. And so it seemed that, they have a distinction between the divine essence, between the hypostases, which are several, and then also between the energies, which are innumerable, right? And
Mhm.
that these aren't just different, words for the same thing, right? These are real, ontological distinctions that they're making. And that primarily, if you're talking about simplicity in the sense that the divine essence is one thing, right? It's not a conglomeration of multiple essential properties or forms, that it transcends the forms in that sense. It's hyperousios, right? Like it's that sort of thing, whatever it is, right? If you're talking about that, then sure, the divine essence is simple, right? What God is one thing. What the divine essence is that the hypostases have is one thing. What, the divine essence that is expressed in the energies is one thing. Sure, there's simplicity there. But you touched on this other aspect of simplicity, which I'm very curious what you found. And there's two aspects of it that I find much more intriguing than that, right? That claim I just made there is a pretty simple, straightforward metaphysical claim. The other claims that show up in them that I find more intriguing that are not as obvious at first, and I'm sure knowing you and your research have come across these. The one is that exactly what you talked about, the fact that one of the things around God, which is one of these terms for energies, right? These sort of articulations, these outward expressions of the essence, is simplicity, which is odd, right? So what does it mean that there is that simplicity is an energy? It makes sense to me to say that justice is an energy, right? It makes sense to me to talk about, God's knowledge being an energy, but what does it mean for simplicity to be an energy? And on a practical level, what's its importance? Because my recollection is, I believe it's Pseudo Dionysius who talks about us becoming simple, right, through participation in God and deification. And part of the question is, what on earth would that mean? It can't mean that all of a sudden, we cease to have multiple organs, right? Or multiple limbs. It can't mean like ontological simplicity. So what is this simplicity by participation that's talked about? What is the energy of simplicity that's being talked about there? And then what is the significance of participating? What does it mean that a creature is made simple through participating in that energy? Because both of those things appear in the Eastern Fathers. So I'm curious.
So I'll take the second question first.
Okay.
Because I think it's probably easier because we're all aware of being divided against ourselves in different ways. Forgive my cat. Here
That's
is
all right.
hungry for lunch. So Plato puts this vividly in terms of the three parts of the soul: reason, spirit, and appetite, that can be opposed to one another. And sometimes you have multiple appetites that are even opposed to one another. He uses the image that reason is like a man who's joined to the hip to a lion, who's joined to the hip to a multi-headed monster.
Right.
And this is reason, spirit the lion, and appetite, the multi-headed monster. So I think part of what it means to participate in that divine simplicity is to be one, to be unified as a person in your relationship to God, your love for God, your desire for God, and that everything else then sort of falls into place around that. And there's not that same self-division. And also, the passions, I think, are relevant here because the passions, these tendencies toward anger and greed and lust and selfishness, are the things that make us self-divided. Anger leads you to say and do things that you regret later, right? Greed can lead you to do something you would never do otherwise. It's almost like an alien force that can take over and take control, and so we experience them as almost, often we'll say, "How did I do that?" or "What made me do that?" Well, that's this experience we have of these tendencies toward evil being alien to what we really are or what we know that we're meant to be. And yet we can't help it. We don't know how to overcome that. And so I think that's what Dionysius is referring to is to become simple is to become one in our relationship to God and therefore in relation to everything else, you might say, without that self-division. So to me, that makes sense. I see one way of describing that process of deification that we were talking about a while ago. It's not the only way. It's maybe a very cryptic way, but it is one way of describing it.
Well,
Um,
and I think
it-
to interject, I think it very much ties in with what Basil of Caesarea talks about, specifically the passage that you were talking about, where he talks about the fact that we don't need to be taught to love God. You already love God because you love the good. And the fact of the
yeah,
matter is, as you pointed out, we have misperceptions about the good, or we have sort of distorted passions or desires or things like that. But I think the sort of thing that you're talking about there, simplicity in that sense, which I think you're right that that's what Pseudo Dionysius is talking about. It's something that brings together. It's that sort of wholeness that would result if we really loved God the way Basil talks about, where rather than
mm,
misunderstanding the good, there was
yeah,
really a singularity of loving the good, and therefore all of the things that express and articulate God are loved in a harmony with it, as opposed to these sort of scattered chasing after all these different things that create inordinate amounts of pain, inner turmoil, conflict, right? All these sorts of things like that. The certain unity and simplicity. So I think it's not. I think that's probably the best explanation for what's going on there. In those writers, and squares quite well with what you already told us from Basil.
yeah. It's important to remember that this is returning to our natural state,
Right.
right? Our natural state is the love of God, and everything else, all the passions and all the self division, are unnatural, and they're the result of the fall. And so all of this works to, it's all, we're seeing the same reality from different angles here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, anyway, so you also asked about how can simplicity be one of the things around God or divine
Mm-hmm.
energy? Um,
And
uh,
and let me interject on top of that just to tie it in. Does that in some ways contradict or conflict with the notion that the divine essence is simple? Or are these just talking about two different metaphysical points? Right? Because
no. Yeah, no conflict at all. The thing to realize is that simplicity, I think, like most attributes, can take different forms
mm-hmm,
and has perhaps different levels.
mm-hmm,
So, what it is for a physical thing, let's say maybe an electron or maybe it's a quark, is perfectly simple physical object.
mm-hmm.
Um, well, that's a very different kind of simplicity than the kind we were just talking about, which
Right.
is the moral and spiritual
Mm-hmm,
attainment of simplicity.
mm-hmm,
God's simplicity is something different again.
mm-hmm,
And just as, if a court could think, okay, the kind of simplicity that consists in loving God wholly and completely would be so far beyond what a quark is able to think.
mm-hmm.
Okay, well, forgive me this for this awkward analogy, but
That's okay.
anyway, the simplicity of God is is in the same way vastly beyond anything we're able to think or comprehend.
Mm-hmm,
Um, it's so what Dionysius does is to use the kind of the stock Platonic idea that things in the sensible world are images of the intelligible reality, the forms, whatever you want to call it. For Dionysius, that process of imaging is precisely what occurs when God comes forth in the divine processions to bestow these divine gifts, such as simplicity or goodness or power or wisdom upon creatures.
mm-hmm,
These are all qualities that are present in God in their original transcendent mode, and but then are imaged into the creatures, thereby you might say kind of flattened out.
mm-hmm,
Um, but it, but it's the only way they can be present within a creature as opposed to their divine source. And it's a lot like the way that, what a tree is. I'm looking at a tree outside my window, is something very rich and complex. And then we can image that into a picture or a painting of a tree. And we, in the process, greatly simplify it.
mm-hmm,
Uh, um, and you can sort of know what the tree is by looking at images. But if you had actually never encountered a real tree, all
mm-hmm,
you had ever seen were pictures of trees, you would have only a very fuzzy and largely mistaken concept of what it is to actually be a tree.
mm-hmm.
Um, You'd be missing the three-dimensionality, the tangibility of it. You wouldn't know what it's like to climb a tree or to pull a leaf off, all these things that you do with real trees. So there's treeness as it actually is in the thing itself, and then as it is within the image. And so I think there's something similar with all the divine attributes, including simplicity, that simplicity of God is like the treeness itself. And then the simplicity that's present in us, even if we attain it, is still only an image of that divine simplicity.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's good. All right, David. Well, so Aristotle East and West, obviously that's one that folks can, if they want to take the deep dive for you. Do you have for folks who, maybe they're like, well, I don't know if I'm ready to read that, that big Cambridge book. Is there anything that you've published or that you can recommend that is concise in terms of dealing with this topic that you could point to? Obviously, I know that you dealt with like the energies in the New Testament. There's an article on St. Vlad's. I should say that people, if they want to go to academia.edu, that's an academic site where they can find you and there find a lot of your PDFs. But are there any other publications you have that you want to point folks to, as well as maybe plug this wherever this article on simplicity is going to be showing up?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Nathan. As a friend, you give me a natural chance to plug my more recent book. So this came out just last year. It's called Divine Energies and Divine Action. And it's a collection of my articles on the essence energies distinction, including the one you mentioned about the energies in the New Testament. And there's one that's chapter 1 of this book called The Concept of the Divine Energies, that is an attempt to introduce the whole subject in a fairly simple, straightforward way. Yeah. As well as some of my more recent thinking long after Aristotle East and West. So anyway, and this is a remarkably inexpensive book. I think it's like $25 or $26.
Who's the publisher?
And you can buy it. IOTA Publications, the International Orthodox Theological Association.
Great.
And that's on the icon is on that cover is an icon of St. Peter raising Tabitha, of course, from the Book of Acts. And that I think is illustrative of the divine energy as it comes to be present in us. One of the gifts of the Spirit is healing. So that's the reason for the cover. And yeah, so also I do have an academia site and many other articles on that site on a lot of different topics. And for what it's worth, if anyone is interested more in the subject of time and eternity and how the Greek fathers understand those, I just did an interview yesterday with a podcast called Faith Unaltered.
Oh, yeah.
And he mentioned he's about to interview you as well.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
Anyway, if you search YouTube for that YouTube channel, Faith Unaltered, you can find a long discussion about God and time and eternity and divine foreknowledge and human freedom as they're viewed by the Greek fathers and how it's different from the West. So yeah, but thanks, Nathan. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. And as you know, I mean, you've said so many nice things about my work, so I feel like I should say that you also have written some incredibly insightful articles on these sorts of subjects. And I hope those will not get lost beneath all the new work you're doing in the film world, So, but people who are interested in these subjects should definitely be looking up what you've written as well.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Well, thanks for being with me, David.